John Wayne was dying. Everyone knew it. The cancer that had taken his lung, his stomach, was now taking everything else. Duke, the toughest man in Hollywood, was 72 years old, gaunt, barely 140 pounds. When he walked into rooms, people would gasp. They'd stare at him with pity. They'd speak to him in soft, careful voices like he was already a ghost. And it was killing him almost as much as the cancer. John Wayne didn't want pity. He didn't want sadness. He didn't want people treating him like he was already dead. Then Dean Martin came to visit. Dean walked into Duke's home, looked at this man who'd lost 80 pounds, who could barely stand, and said, "Jesus, Duke, you look like hell. What happened? You stop eating beef?" Wayne stared at Dean for a moment. Then he started laughing, real laughing, the kind of laugh that comes from relief, because Dean Martin had just given him something nobody else would, normalcy. No pity, no sadness, just two old friends giving each other hell. And in that moment, John Wayne wasn't a dying man. He was Duke. And Dean knew that's exactly what his friend needed. 1959. How Duke and Dean became friends. To understand the significance of Dean Martin's final visit to John Wayne, you need to understand who these men were to each other, and you need to understand what it means to watch a legend die. John Wayne and Dean Martin met in 1959 on the set of Rio Bravo. Duke was already an established icon, the embodiment of American masculinity, the cowboy who defined a generation of Western films. Dean was transitioning from singer and comedian to serious actor, trying to prove he was more than just half of Martin and Lewis or a member of the Rat Pack. Director Howard Hawks had cast Dean in Rio Bravo as Dude, an alcoholic deputy trying to redeem himself. It was a serious, dramatic role, far removed from the cool crooner persona Dean was known for. Duke was initially skeptical. He'd seen Dean's comedies. He wasn't sure Dean could handle the emotional weight of the character. But from the first day of shooting, Duke realized he'd been wrong. Dean was a natural actor. He brought vulnerability, pain, and authenticity to Dude in ways that surprised everyone on set. Duke watched Dean work and gained immense respect for his talent. More importantly, they became friends. Real friends, not Hollywood friends who smile for cameras and never see each other otherwise, but genuine friends who enjoyed each other's company. Duke appreciated Dean's lack of pretension. Dean didn't try to impress anyone. He didn't play political games. He was just Dean, cool, funny, talented, and completely unbothered by Hollywood nonsense. Dean appreciated Duke's straightforwardness. Duke said what he meant. He treated people with respect if they earned it. And Dean had earned it. They worked together again in 1970 on The Undefeated and developed an even deeper friendship. They'd call each other occasionally, they'd run into each other at industry events and always make time to catch up. It wasn't an everyday friendship, but it was real. By 1979, both men had been through hell in their personal lives. Dean's marriage to Jean had ended, his drinking had increased, he was dealing with the pressures of maintaining his career as he aged. But Duke's burden was far heavier. Duke was dying.
The Cancer Returns, 1978 to 1979. John Wayne had been diagnosed with lung cancer in 1964. He'd had his left lung and several ribs removed. He'd beaten it, or so it seemed, for 15 years. Duke had been cancer-free, continuing to make movies, remaining a Hollywood icon. But in 1978, the cancer returned. This time, it was in his stomach. Duke underwent surgery to have his stomach removed in January 1979. The surgery was brutal. Duke lost massive amounts of weight. His once powerful 6'4" frame, which had typically carried 220 to 230 pounds, was now down to barely 140. Duke looked like a skeleton. His face was gaunt. His clothes hung off him. His famous swagger was gone, replaced by the slow, careful movements of a very sick man. But Duke wasn't ready to die. He was stubborn. He was John Wayne, goddammit. And John Wayne didn't quit. So even though he was clearly dying, Duke kept making public appearances. He wanted to show the world and himself that he was still here, still fighting, still Duke. On April 9, 1979, Duke appeared at the Academy Awards to present the Best Picture Award. It was supposed to be a triumphant moment, a Hollywood legend taking the stage one more time. Instead, it was heartbreaking. When Duke walked onto that stage, the audience gasped. Some people started crying immediately. Duke was so thin, so frail, so clearly dying that it was shocking to see. He could barely walk. His voice, once booming and powerful, was weak. But Duke stood there and did his job. He presented the award with as much dignity as he could muster. The audience gave him a standing ovation, not for the presentation, but because they knew they were watching a dying man's final public moment. The cruelty of pity. Everyone treats Duke like he's already dead. Backstage after the ceremony, Duke was surrounded by well-wishers, celebrities, executives, crew members. Everyone wanted to tell Duke how brave he was, how much they admired him, how he'd always be remembered. Duke smiled and nodded and thanked them, but inside he was dying a different death, the death of being pitied, the death of being treated like he was already gone. People would approach him with tears in their eyes. They'd hug him gently like he might break. They'd say things like, "You're so brave," and "You're an inspiration," and "We're praying for you." Duke appreciated their kindness, he really did. But what he wanted, what he desperately needed, was for someone to treat him like he wasn't dying. To treat him like he was still Duke, still the tough, ornery bastard who'd take shit from nobody.
The visit. Dean does what no one else would. A few weeks after the Oscars, Dean Martin called Duke's house. Dean had seen Duke at the Academy Awards. He'd seen what everyone else saw, a man who was clearly in his final days. And Dean decided he needed to visit his friend. But Dean didn't call to ask how Duke was feeling or to offer prayers or sympathy. Dean called and said, "Duke, I'm coming by tomorrow. Make sure you're home and not dying or anything inconvenient like that." Duke laughed. Actually laughed. His daughter, Isa, who'd answered the phone initially, heard her father laughing from the other room and couldn't believe it. Duke hadn't really laughed in weeks. The next day, Dean showed up at Duke's home in Newport Beach. Duke's family was nervous. They'd seen how visitors affected Duke, how exhausting it was for him to maintain his tough guy persona when he felt so weak. They didn't want Dean's visit to drain what little energy Duke had left. Dean rang the doorbell. Isa answered. She looked at Dean with sad eyes and started to say, "Mr. Martin, thank you for coming. My father is—" "Is he awake?" Dean interrupted. "Yes, but he's very weak and—" "Then let's not waste time. Where is he?" Dean walked past Isa into the house. He found Duke sitting in his living room, wrapped in a robe that used to fit him, but now looked 3 sizes too big. Duke looked up when Dean entered. For a moment, the two men just looked at each other. Dean saw what everyone else had seen, his friend reduced to a shadow of himself. Duke saw something in Dean's eyes too, but it wasn't pity. It was recognition, like Dean was looking past the disease and seeing the man underneath. Then Dean said, "Jesus, Duke, you look like hell. What happened? You stop eating beef?" Duke's family held their breath. You couldn't say things like that. Duke was dying. You had to be gentle, supportive, careful. But Duke stared at Dean for a long moment. Then his face broke into a huge grin and he started laughing, deep, genuine laughter. "Screw you, Dean," Duke said, still laughing. "I'll kick your ass even like this." "With what? Those toothpick legs? I've seen stronger sticks holding up tomato plants." Duke laughed harder. "Get over here, you bastard." They argued about which Western directors were actually worth a damn. Dean said Howard Hawks was overrated. Duke called Dean a moron. They both laughed. Dean told a dirty joke about a cowboy and a showgirl that Duke had probably heard before but still found funny.
Duke tried to tell one back, but started coughing halfway through. Dean waited patiently, then finished the joke for him, deliberately getting the punchline wrong. Duke corrected him, and they argued about the proper way to tell a dirty joke. At no point did the conversation turn serious. At no point did Dean's face show sadness or pity. He treated Duke exactly as he always had, with irreverent humor, casual affection, and complete acceptance. Duke's daughter, Isa, watched from the doorway at one point. She later said, "I saw my father laugh more in those 2 hours with Dean than he had in the previous 2 months. Dean wasn't careful with him. He wasn't gentle. He was just Dean, and that's exactly what my father needed." The goodbye that wasn't. Dean's final moment with Duke. After about 2 hours, Dean stood up. "All right, Duke, I gotta get going. I've got a thing." "A thing?" Duke asked, smiling. "What kind of thing?" "The kind where I do things. None of your business." Duke laughed. "Get out of here, you bum." Dean started walking toward the door, then turned back. For just a moment, one brief moment, his cool facade cracked. His eyes met Duke's, and there was something there. Recognition, love, grief, all the things Dean hadn't said out loud. "Dean," Dean said quietly. "Yeah?" Dean wanted to say so many things. He wanted to say, "I'm going to miss you. I'm sorry this is happening. Thank you for your friendship. You're one of the best men I've ever known." But Dean knew that saying those things would shatter the gift he'd just given Duke. It would turn the visit into a goodbye. It would acknowledge what both men knew, but neither wanted to admit. So instead, Dean said, "Try to eat something, would you? You're making the rest of us look fat." Duke grinned. "Get out of here before I throw something at you." Dean left. He walked out of Duke's house, got in his car, and drove away. And he never saw John Wayne alive again.
June 11th, 1979. Duke died. Duke died on June 11th, 1979, just 2 months after Dean's visit. The cancer had finally won. Duke's final weeks were painful and difficult. He was in and out of consciousness. His family stayed by his side. Hollywood mourned. At Duke's funeral, Dean Martin was one of the pallbearers. He stood alongside Frank Sinatra, James Stewart, and other Hollywood legends, carrying the casket of one of the greatest actors who ever lived. After the funeral, someone asked Dean about his final visit with Duke. "Did you know it would be the last time you'd see him?" Dean was quiet for a moment. "Yeah, I knew." "Did you say goodbye?" "No." "Why not?" Dean looked away, his eyes distant. Because Duke didn't need goodbye. He needed to be treated like he was still Duke, like he was still here. Saying goodbye would have been admitting he was leaving, and he wasn't ready for that. "Do you regret not saying it?" Dean thought about that. "No. Duke knew how I felt. We didn't need to say the words. What he needed from me was to be his friend, not his mourner. So that's what I was." The meaning, what Dean's visit really meant. Years later, Duke's daughter, Isa, wrote about Dean's visit in her memoir. She said, "Dean Martin's final visit to my father was one of the most loving things I've ever witnessed. Everyone else who came to see Dad in those final months came to say goodbye. They came to tell him how much he'd meant to them. They came to cry and hug him and make peace. And Dad appreciated all of it, but it was exhausting. It reinforced that he was dying, that he was leaving, that people were already mourning him while he was still alive. Dean didn't do that. Dean came and gave Dad 2 hours where he wasn't the dying man. He was just Duke, hanging out with his friend Dean. They joked, they laughed, they talked about stupid things that didn't matter. And in doing that, Dean gave my father something more valuable than any goodbye. He gave him his dignity. He gave him normalcy. He gave him 2 hours of feeling alive instead of feeling like he was already dead. After Dean left, my father said to me, "That's the first time in months someone's treated me like a man instead of a patient." He had tears in his eyes, but he was smiling. Dean had given him a gift that nobody else could give. The lesson: true friendship in the face of death. The story of Dean Martin's final visit to John Wayne is more than just 2 Hollywood legends. It's about what it means to truly love someone who's dying. Most people, when they visit someone who's terminally ill, come for themselves. They come to say goodbye so they'll have closure. They come to express their feelings so they won't have regrets. They come to make peace so they can move on. Dean didn't come for himself. He came for Duke. He came to give Duke what Duke needed, not what Dean needed. And what Duke needed wasn't tears or goodbyes or sympathy. Duke needed to feel like Duke one last time. That's real friendship. That's real love. Not making it about your feelings, but about what the other person needs. Not saying what you want to say, but doing what needs to be done. Dean Martin could have walked into Duke's house and cried. He could have told Duke how much their friendship meant to him. He could have said a proper goodbye, and Duke would have understood. Duke would have appreciated it. But Dean knew that Duke had already heard all of that from everyone else. What Duke hadn't heard, what Duke desperately needed, was someone treating him like he wasn't dying. So Dean gave him that gift. And it was the greatest act of friendship and compassion that anyone showed John Wayne in his final days.
Full circle. Dean's own understanding of death. When Dean Martin died in 1995, his daughter Deanna talked about her father's philosophy on death and friendship. She said, "My father believed that when someone is dying, the kindest thing you can do is not make them feel like they're dying. Don't make their illness the center of every conversation. Don't treat them like they're fragile. Don't speak to them in sad, careful voices. Treat them like they're still the person they've always been, because that's who they want to be, even if their body is failing them." That's what Dad did for Duke. He didn't pretend Duke wasn't sick. He acknowledged it with humor, joking about how thin Duke was, how bad he looked, but he didn't dwell on it. He didn't make it the focus. He moved past it and just hung out with his friend. And that's the greatest gift you can give someone who's dying, the gift of still being seen as alive. The final lesson: dignity over goodbye. The lesson of Dean Martin's visit to John Wayne isn't about death, it's about dignity. It's about seeing past the disease to the person underneath. It's about giving people what they need, not what you think they should need. John Wayne was dying. Everyone knew it. But for 2 hours on that afternoon in 1979, Dean Martin made sure that Duke wasn't a dying man. He was just Duke, still tough, still ornery, still laughing. And when Duke died 2 months later, one of his final good memories was sitting in his living room with Dean Martin, trading insults and dirty jokes like they'd done on the set of Rio Bravo 20 years earlier. That's friendship. That's love. That's Dean Martin. Not the cool crooner, not the king of cool, just Dean. A man who understood that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is treating them exactly as you always have, even when everything has changed. John Wayne died knowing that at least one person still saw him as Duke, and that person was Dean Martin.